Shadow Director, Dissecting the DSM, Episode 5, The Injection and the Code. The needle went in at 3:15 in the afternoon. Not that he knew the time then. Clocks were removed from psychiatric units. Time became fluid, measured only by meal trays and medication rounds. But later, when he requested his medical records, he would see it documented. 3:15 p.m., intramuscular injection, haloperidol 5 milligrams, lorazepam 2 milligrams, administered for agitation. Welcome back to Shadow Director, Dissecting the DSM. In our previous episodes, we explored how the DSM fragments experience into codes, how F31.9 became a profit center, and how emergency funding amplified fraud. Today, we're going inside, into the actual experience of being coded, sedated, and documented. This is the story of what happens when a person becomes a billing opportunity, when trauma becomes a diagnosis, and when the system's financial incentives override human complexity. Let's start with the injection itself, the cold swab of alcohol on the deltoid muscle, the pinch of the needle-breaking skin, the burn as the medication entered muscle tissue. Haloperidol first, an antipsychotic, though he wasn't psychotic. Lorazepam second, a benzodiazepine, though his panic wasn't a seizure. The combination, known in psychiatric units as a B52 or chemical restraint, designed to sedate quickly, to calm through force, to make the patient manageable. Within minutes, the world began to blur. Not sleep, not rest, chemical submission. His muscles went heavy, his thoughts slowed to sludge, his body became a weight he could barely lift. He tried to stand, to walk to his room, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. 2 staff members helped him, one on each side, half carrying him down the corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead created halos, trails of light that followed his vision. The floor seemed to tilt, to shift under his feet. He was aware, but trapped, conscious enough to know what was happening, sedated enough to be powerless. This was the 3rd hospitalization, 21 years old. The intake had been brief, 15 minutes, maybe 20. Forms filled out, questions asked, answers documented. He'd arrived in a state of elevated energy, talking fast, moving restlessly, unable to sit still. Not mania, not in the clinical sense. This was compensatory, a surge of agency after weeks of terror, a protest against the panic that had been consuming him. But the clinician didn't see that. The clinician saw elevated mood, increased energy, decreased need for sleep. The clinician saw F31.9. The injection was justified in the documentation as necessary for safety. The patient was agitated. The patient was restless. The patient was a risk to himself or others. But here's what the documentation didn't capture. The injection wasn't about safety. It was about efficiency. A sedated patient is a manageable patient. A manageable patient requires less staff time, less monitoring, less intervention. And a sedated patient can't question the diagnosis, can't challenge the code, can't resist the billing. He spent the next 6 hours in a chemical fog, not asleep, not awake, somewhere in between, where time lost meaning and the body became a foreign object. He could hear the unit around him, doors opening and closing, voices in the hallway, the distant sound of a television, but it all felt distant, removed, as if happening to someone else. His own thoughts were slow, thick, like trying to think through honey. He tried to remember why he was there, what had led to this moment, but the memories were fragmented, disconnected, lost in the chemical haze. The next morning, when the sedation had mostly worn off, he was called to the nursing station. Medication review. The psychiatrist, a man he'd never met before, reviewed his chart, asked a few questions, adjusted his medications. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes, but in those 10 minutes, F31.9 was confirmed, documented, and entered into the billing system. The code was now permanent, part of his medical record, following him like a shadow. Let's examine what happened here in detail. The patient arrived with elevated energy, a response to trauma, a compensatory surge after weeks of panic. But the system didn't see trauma. The system saw symptoms. Elevated mood? Check. Increased energy? Check. Decreased need for sleep? Check. 31.9. The code was applied without exploring the trauma, without understanding the context, without recognizing that this wasn't a primary mood disorder, but a response to overwhelming pressure. The injection was administered not because the patient was dangerous, but because he was inconvenient. An agitated patient requires staff attention. A sedated patient requires minimal attention. And in a system driven by volume and profit, efficiency matters more than understanding. Sedate the patient, document the code, bill for the service, move on to the next one. But here's where the fraud becomes visible. F31.9, unspecified bipolar disorder, requires almost no documentation. Unlike F31.0, which requires evidence of a full manic episode lasting at least 7 days. With specific symptoms documented, F31.9 requires almost nothing. A patient shows mood variability, F31.9. A patient has elevated energy, F31.9. The code is so broad, so undefined, that it can be applied to almost anyone who shows any sign of mood fluctuation. And F31.9 is profitable. Insurance companies pay more for bipolar diagnoses because they're considered more serious, more complex, more in need of ongoing care. A typical therapy session for anxiety might bill at $150. A medication management appointment for depression might bill at $200. But a bipolar diagnosis, even an unspecified one, can justify more intensive treatment, more frequent visits, more complex medication regimens. The billing can easily reach $300, $400, even $500 per visit. In this case, the injection itself was billable. The medication administration was billable. The 10-minute medication review was billable. The F31.9 diagnosis justified all of it. And once the code was in the record, it would justify future visits, future medications, future billing opportunities. The patient wasn't just being treated, he was being coded, documented, and monetized. The physical experience of sedation is something the DSM doesn't capture. The heavy limbs, the blurred vision, the slowed thoughts, the sense of being trapped in your own body, none of this appears in diagnostic criteria, but it's real, it's documented, and it's billable. The injection, the monitoring, the documentation, the billing, all of it becomes part of the financial structure that shapes care. He would learn later to read his medical records, to see what was documented, what codes were applied, what justifications were given, and he would discover something disturbing. The documentation didn't match his experience. The records described agitation, risk, necessity, but his memory was different. He remembered elevated energy, yes, but also clarity, purpose, a surge of agency after weeks of terror. He remembered trying to explain, to communicate, to be understood. But the system didn't need understanding. The system needed codes. The fraud here isn't just about misdiagnosis. It's about the entire structure. The rushed intake, the quick code application, the chemical restraint, the minimal follow-up, the ongoing billing. Each step serves the financial system more than the patient. The code justifies the injection. The injection justifies the monitoring. The monitoring justifies the billing. And the billing creates incentives for more codes, more injections, more billing. But the patient's actual experience, the trauma, the panic, the compensatory energy, the need for understanding rather than sedation, none of that matters in the billing system. What matters is the code, the documentation, the reimbursement. The DSM provides the categories, but the financial system provides the incentives. And when those incentives reward volume over accuracy, codes over care, billing over understanding, the system becomes a mechanism for exploitation. The oversight mechanisms are weak. Who checks whether F31.9 was applied correctly? Who audits whether the injection was medically necessary? Who questions whether the documentation matches the patient's experience? The answer too often is no one. Insurance companies process claims, but they don't typically audit diagnostic accuracy. They rely on provider documentation, and if the documentation supports F31.9, the claim is paid. By the time he was discharged, F31.9 was permanent. It was in his medical record, in his insurance file, in every future provider's assessment. The code had power. It shaped his care, his identity in the system's eyes, his future interactions with providers. He wasn't a person with trauma, with panic, with compensatory responses. He was F31.9, a billing code, a profit center, a diagnosis that would follow him for life. But here's what he also learned. The code wasn't the truth. His mania wasn't a primary mood disorder. It was a response to trauma, a compensation for terror, a temporary surge of agency in the face of overwhelming pressure. The DSM had a category for it, the system had a code for it, and the billing had a classification for it. But the experience itself, the human experience, the actual pattern of trauma and response, remained larger than any single code could contain. The injection at 3:15 p.m. was just one moment in a larger pattern, but it reveals something essential. When financial incentives override clinical accuracy, when codes matter more than understanding, when sedation replaces care, the system becomes a mechanism for harm. The DSM provides the categories, but we must understand how those categories function in the real world, how they create incentives, and how they can be misused. In our next episode, we'll solve the mystery. We'll trace the clues from the beginning, the codes, the injections, the billing, the fraud, and reveal who or what is responsible for the harm. The answer isn't a single person, a single provider, or a single facility. The answer is the system itself, the financial structures, the billing codes, the incentives that reward volume over accuracy, codes over care, profit over people. Thank you for joining us. The injection at 3:15 p.m. was documented, coded, and billed, but the human experience, the trauma, the panic, the compensatory energy, the need for understanding, remained invisible, obscured by the very system that claimed to help. Until next time, remember, the codes have power, but understanding them is the first step toward reclaiming agency.